Hey everyone, welcome to part 44 of my Pokemon game series in Unity. So in this video, we will look at a concept called additive scene loading. This will help us to smoothly move from one scene to another without actually switching the scene. So let me explain what I mean. So right now, I am in the hometown scene, and when I'm in the hometown scene, the second scene, which is the Route 1 scene, will automatically be loaded, right? So if I minimize the game window, you can see that when I'm in the hometown scene, the route 1 scene is also loaded. And when I go to route 1 scene, all the connected scenes of route 1 will also be loaded, right? So here route 1 has two connected scenes. One is hometown and one is town 2. So by using this approach, we can go between scenes without actually switching them. And we'll also unload the scenes that are not connected to the current scene. So for example, if I come back to hometown, you can see that the town 2 scene is unloaded since it's not directly connected to hometown. So let's look at how to implement this. Special thanks to all my Patreons for making the series possible. By becoming a Patreon, you can support me in the making of the series and get access to some cool rewards like the complete project files of the series, which also contains some advanced features that are not covered here. So let's start the video. So I have cleaned up the hometown and route 1 scene a little. So this is the hometown scene and this is going to be a route 1 scene. Alright, so now to implement additive scene loading, I'm going to create a new scene called gameplay. Alright, so this will be the scene to run in order to play the game, and from this scene we will load all our levels. So let me just delete the main camera. So this scene is empty now. So first, let's look at how to open multiple scenes at the same time in Unity. So right now the gameplay scene is open, and if I right click on the hometown scene and select open scene additive, then it will also be opened alongside the gameplay scene. Alright, so let's also open our route 1 scene. So now these three scenes are open at the same time. So what we have to do is we have to arrange all our scenes next to each other and then load them dynamically from the gameplay scene. So right now you can see that the route 1 scene is on top of the hometown scene. So we have to change their position and connect them in order to create our map. Okay, so I'll select the grid from route 1 and I'll move it above the hometown scene. Alright, so I'll change the Y to 20 in order to align it perfectly. So now the route 1 scene is right on top of the hometown scene, and when using this method we don't need portals to switch between scenes. So let me delete the portal from route 1 and the hometown. Alright, and by the way, don't delete the portal of the indoor scene. We'll still need portals to switch to the indoor scenes. Alright, so now if we test the game, we have both scenes connected like this, and we can easily go from one scene to another. Alright, but this is just temporary. One thing to note is that the hometown and route 1 scene is not inside our gameplay scene. It's just opened alongside the gameplay scene. So if I change to some other scene and then come back to the gameplay scene, you can see that it's empty. So what we have to do is we have to dynamically load the hometown and route 1 scene into our gameplay scene. Alright, so to do that, I'll create triggers for each scene inside the gameplay scene, and these triggers will be responsible for loading the scene. So once again, I'll open the hometown and route 1 scene, and now inside the gameplay scene, I'll create a new game object called hometown. Alright, and I'll reset its position. So this is going to be the trigger that will be responsible for loading the hometown scene. Okay, so I'll add a box collider 2D to it. So the box collider is pretty small, so we have to make it as big to cover the entire hometown scene. So let me increase its size. Since I know my hometown scene is 20 by 20, I can manually enter that, and then I can change the offsets so that it covers the scene. Okay, so now the trigger covers the scene perfectly. So next we have to check the is trigger checkbox. So this will make it a trigger instead of a collider. Alright, so next we need to be able to detect when the player enters this trigger. So let's add a script to do that. So inside script, inside scene management, I'll create a new script called scene details, and let me drag the script onto our trigger. So inside the script, I'll use the on trigger enter 2D function. So this function will be called whenever some object enters the trigger of this game object. So inside this function, we have to make sure that the object entered was the player. So for that, I'll check if collision dot tag equal to player. And if that's the case, then I'll log a message saying entered and the name of the scene. Okay, so we can get the name of the scene from game object dot name. So yeah, I forgot to mention it. Whenever you're creating a trigger for the scene, you have to give it the same name of the scene. So this is because we'll be using the name of the scene in order to load it. Alright, so when we get game object dot name, it should print hometown, right? So in order for this to work, our player game object should have the tag player. So if we open the player, let's actually turn this into a prefab so that we can easily access it. And let's open the player prefab. So here you can see that it's untagged right now. So for our code to work, we need to tag it as the player. Alright. So another thing that's required is the player must have a rigid body and a box collider 2D. Alright, so we added this in the first video when we created the player. So in case you haven't done that, then make sure to add these two. Alright, so let's test if our trigger is working. So if I play the game, the message entered hometown is being printed over here. Alright, so the trigger is working. So next, let's create a trigger for the route 1 scene. So first let me turn this into a prefab. Alright, and I'll name this prefab something like scene trigger. So next I'll duplicate this and create a trigger for route 1 scene. So right now the route 1 trigger is on top of the hometown scene itself. So let's move it up and let's make it cover the route 1 scene. Okay, so I'll set the Y to 20 in order to align it perfectly. So yeah, now we have triggers for hometown scene and route 1 scene. So if we test the game, by default it will show enter hometown, and when we go to the route 1 scene, you can see that it shows enter route 1. Alright, so if I come back, it will show enter hometown, and when I go back to route 1, it changes. So in case this is not changing for you, you might be using the collapse button. So if the collapse is on, it will be stacked on top of each other and it will not change while testing. Alright, so next we have to dynamically load the scene when the player enters its trigger. Right now we are not loading anything, so if we go to some other scene and come back to gameplay scene, and if we try to test it, you can see that none of the scenes are loaded. So we should dynamically load the scene from these triggers. Alright, so in the scene detail script, if the player enters the trigger, I want to load the scene with this name, right? So how can we load a scene? We can use scene manager dot load scene function, just like we did in our portal script. Okay, so here I'll call scene manager. So in order to use scene manager, I have to import unity engine dot scene management, and I'll call load scene async function. So here, instead of giving the scene index, I'll pass the name of the scene. Alright, and when loading the scene like this, we want to load the scene additively, right? When we load the hometown scene, the gameplay scene should not be destroyed. So in order to load the scene additively, what we can do is we can pass the load scene mode as the second parameter. So for the second parameter, I'll pass load scene mode dot additive. Alright, so this will load our scene additively without destroying the scenes that are currently open. So next, if the scene is already loaded, then we have to make sure not to load the scene twice. So for that, what I'll do is I'll create a boolean called is loaded. So this will keep track of if the scene is loaded or not. And we only want to load the scene if the scene is not already loaded. Okay. And after loading the scene, I'll set is loaded to true. So this will make sure our scene will only be loaded once. So let me place this code inside a function, since we have to call this from multiple places. So I'll create a function called load scene, and I'll paste the code to load the scene. Alright, and from here I'll just call the load scene function. So now the scene will be loaded when the player enters its trigger. So let's go back to Unity, and before we test, we need to add the essential objects loader into our gameplay scene. So let's do that. So this will load the player and all the other essential objects for us. So let's test the game. Alright, so you can see that the hometown scene has been loaded dynamically. And if we go to the route 1 trigger, then you can see that the route 1 scene has also been loaded. So if you pause the game, you can see that all these scenes are being loaded additively. So that works. So next, when loading a scene, we should also load all its connected scenes. So let me explain what I mean. So the hometown and the route 1 scene are connected, right? So if I go through here, I can go to the route 1 scene. So what we have to do is, when we load the hometown scene, we should also load the route 1 scene. Alright, otherwise the problem is we'll see this dark area over here instead of the route 1 scene. Alright, so we need a way to indicate that two scenes are connected, and when loading a scene, we should also load all its connected scenes. Alright, so for that, inside the scene details script, I'll create a new list of scene details and call this connected scenes. Okay, so now when the player is on this scene, we also have to load all its connected scenes, right? So after loading the current scene, we need to load all the connected scenes. So I'll use a for each loop to loop through all the connected scenes. And I'll call scene dot load scene in order to load each one of them. Okay, so this should load all the connected scenes. So let's go back to Unity and assign the connected scenes. So we know that hometown scene is connected to the route 1 scene, and the route 1 scene is connected to the hometown scene. So to test this properly, we need to add one more scene. Alright, so first let's open up our hometown and route 1 scene, and then I'll duplicate my hometown scene to create another scene called town 2. Alright, so town 2 will be after the route 1 in the map. So let me also open town 2, and right now it's just on top of the hometown. So I'll select the grid and I'll place it next to route 1. Okay, so let me change the x to -20, and I'll change the y to 20. Alright, so we'll be entering the town 2 from route 1. So when duplicating and moving a scene like that, make sure to move all the other elements in that scene, right? So the NPC of the town 2 scene is actually right here. So we need to move that to town 2, and the portal for this house also need to be moved. But for now, I don't need a portal for the house, so I'll just delete it. And I'll also delete the trainer from here. So yeah, that's one thing that you have to be careful about. When duplicating a scene, make sure to remove or move all the objects in it. So next, I'll just open a way in this fence to enter the town 2. So let me do that really quick. And you can remove this layer of fence inside town 2 since we already have a fence here. So let me do that. Alright, so finally let me just fill in the gaps. So next, I'll make some changes in town 2 just to differentiate it from the hometown. Alright, so I'll just place something like this over there. Alright, so we have created our town 2 scene. So next, let's add a trigger for it. So I'll just duplicate the trigger for route 1, rename it to town 2, and I just have to move it left and make it cover the town 2. So here I can just use -20 to align it perfectly. So now let's look at how the scenes are connected. So the hometown is connected to route 1, and the route 1 is connected to both the hometown and town 2, right? From route 1 we can directly go to the hometown, and we can also go to town 2. So it's connected to both hometown and town 2, and the town 2 is only connected to the route 1. Okay, so that's how we should define our connections. So if you look at the hometown, it's connected to route 1. Route 1 is connected to hometown, but it should also be connected to town 2. So let me drag town 2 here, and finally town 2 only needs to be connected to route 1. Okay, so let's close every other scene and just open the gameplay scene. So before we test the game, we have to add the town 2 to build settings. So let me open the build settings and drag town 2 over here. Alright, so now let's test if the connected scenes are loading properly. Okay, so I'll minimize my game tab and I'll place it over here so I can see what's happening in the scene window. So yeah, initially you can see that only the hometown and route 1 is loaded. So as soon as the player reaches the route 1 scene, you can see that the town 2 is loaded over here. Alright, so all the connected scenes are loading properly. So next we have to make sure to unload all the unwanted scenes. So right now if I go back to hometown, you can see that town 2 is still loaded, right? But we don't want that. If a scene is no longer connected to the current scene, then we should unload that scene. So let's look at how to do that. So in the scene details script, after loading all the connected scenes, we can unload the scenes that are no longer connected. So for this, we need to get the list of previously loaded scenes, right? So what I'll do is, inside the game controller script, I'll keep track of the current scene that's loaded and the previously loaded scene. Alright, so I'll create a property over here. Alright, this one's going to be the current scene. And I'll create another one to store the previous scene. And then I'll create a public function to set the current scene. So in this function, before setting the current scene, first I need to store the current scene into the previous scene, right? And then I can change the current scene. Alright, so we need to call this function whenever we load a new scene. So here I'll call gameController.instance.set current scene and pass this as current scene. Alright, so now we have a reference of the current scene and the previous scene. So to unload the scenes that are not used, first I'll check if the previous scene is not null. So I'll say gameController.instance.previous scene is not null. So if that's the case, it means all the connected scenes of this previous scenes were loaded earlier, right? So what we can do is we have to loop through all those scenes and we can unload them if they are no longer connected. So I'll create a variable called previously loaded scenes. So this will be all the connected scenes of the previous scene. Okay, so next I'll loop through all the previously loaded scenes, and if they are no longer connected, then we can just unload them. So for that, I'll say if connected scene does not contain the scene, and also this scene should not be equal to the currently loaded scene, right? So what we are saying is if this scene is not the currently loaded scene, and if it's not in the connected scene of the currently loaded scene, then we no longer need it, right? So we can just unload that scene. So first let me create a function to unload a scene. So I'll just copy this load scene function and rename it to unload. So we should only try to unload a scene if it's already loaded, and in order to unload a scene we can call unload scene async, and for the unload we don't need to pass the scene mode, so let's remove that. So this should unload the scene, and after unloading it we can set is loaded to false. Alright, so now let's call this function from here. Okay, so this should unload the scenes if they are no longer connected. So let's try this out. Okay, let me minimize the game. So yeah, right now we have hometown and route 1 loaded. So if I go to route 1, now you can see that town 2 is loaded. And now if I come back to my hometown, you can see that town 2 is unloaded. So the unloading is working fine. So let's try going to town 2. Okay, so when we are in town 2, the hometown is unloaded. So yeah, our logic to unload the unused scenes are working fine. So I'll stop the video here. In the next video, we will look at how to use this same approach for the indoor scenes, and we'll also fix some of the bugs that we currently have. So right now you might have some bugs in wild Pokemon encounters, so we'll fix things like that in the next video. So before you leave, please make sure to leave a like on the video and consider subscribing to my channel. That'll really help me out. So I'll see you in the next video.